Cool. Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great. And you?
Pretty good. I'm on vacation right now, technically, so 10 a.m. is earlier than my brain is expecting, but it's all good.
Yeah, I understand that. I I haven't had a client for a while, so I tend to be I'm not a morning person. So I tend to sleep in more and more.
Yeah, I mostly work with people on the West Coast right now, which is great because I don't actually have to be functional until around noon my time when they start signing on. So where should we start? I kind of caught bits of the last conversation, but I missed the last 3 minutes because I was getting milk for my tea.
So mostly we were talking about learning, and uh, maybe maybe it'd be a good time to shift some of that conversation to more specifically about technical learning.
Sure. I did catch on the last one that you mentioned that you were an English major, which I never knew before. I'm also a liberal arts major. I studied economics in undergrad and didn't switch over to tech until a few years ago. So there's a lot of new stuff to learn. I never really considered myself a technologist. Still don't really. It's this weird, I don't know, this is an identity that I think I don't 100% buy into. But yeah, like what do you think? What do you think good looks like in terms of technical learning?
Oh, you know, software development is really one of the tough jobs to have because it's always changing, and so you have to keep learning to stay in place. So you got to keep running all the time. And people that don't get left behind. My own chops as a programmer, are way out of date and somewhat atrophied. Um, because I've done recent years, I've done a lot more coaching than I have programming. Usually when I'm programming, I'm pairing with someone else. And so I'm leaning on their up-to-date knowledge, and I'm relying on sort of deeper themes and patterns. And that's something that I think is important. I, way long time ago, Joe Rainsberger ran XP Day Manhattan, and I gave a talk there on a sustainable career.
Interesting. Okay.
And dealing with that very problem. And I took a look at what's the half-life of the things that you're learning. Because I remember once upon a time in my career where friends were telling me, oh, you should learn the Windows 3 API. You can make a lot of money as a Windows 3 programmer. And I didn't do that. I was learning things like coupling and cohesion and how that played out in different things that I was working on. I was probably still doing a bunch of assembly language programming and some hardware development, microprocessor circuits, and some C. And so I was taking the stuff about coupling and cohesion that I had learned while doing assembly language programming and applying it in C, and organizing things so that, and I don't know, this may go back to my English background also, so that when you started looking at a file, you could see what you needed to know right off the bat. You could see what was important in terms of definitions, in terms of includes, and the guts of what you were trying to work with. And anything that was global to that module, it was right there. If it wasn't needed throughout the module, then it would be at the smallest scope that it fit. So it might still be technically global to the module, but if it was only used by 3 methods, it was down on top, right next to those 3 methods. So you didn't have to go looking somewhere else. So you could, see things at a glance. And so that sort of organizational stuff and keeping things that are separate, putting things that belong together. And sometimes those are the same things, but in different views of them.
Yeah, I remember early in my career. So in 2014, I career switched into tech by doing a coding bootcamp. And back in 2014, that was before coding bootcamps were widely known or, like a run thing. That was before that was really a paved path into software. And the person, Enrique Comba, was my coach at this bootcamp. And I look back on those days, I'm like, wow, I was ridiculously lucky back then to have been, like introduced to programming by someone who cared that deeply about readability of code, about testability, about these like really advanced concepts. And by like in week 2 of the boot camp, we were learning Chicago style versus London style TDD, which I look back on that and it's kind of wild. It's like most of the many full-time programmers that I have worked with in my career don't know the difference between those two or don't care about the difference. And I sort of look back on those days and realize that it's kind of, I think it's that like Aristotle idea of like form the habit first and then later you'll learn why you have those habits. But we went through the motions of doing TDD, learning how to mock, learning the solid principles, learning design patterns, all of these things. And back then I was like, okay, cool. This feels a little bit like being in school where you're given a formula, you memorize it, and then you just apply it until your fingers fall off. And it was only like years and years and years later when I, after working in a couple different jobs, when I finally realized like, oh, like that's why the open close principle matters. And that's why, TDD matters. I think I probably wrote upwards of 1,000 tests using TDD before realizing what TDD is actually about.
Yeah, that reminds me of a lecture that my English teacher in high school gave, a full class period on learn the trade and the tricks will follow.
Yeah.
Because people were looking for, oh, what's the shortcut here? And without learning the basics.
Yeah, exactly. I see that a lot at, so I work at GitHub now, and I mostly do monolith development in Ruby on Rails. And it's been a couple of years since I've touched Rails, honestly. So going into this job, I was a little apprehensive and I was like, I don't know the latest Rails patterns anymore. I'm gonna have to actually order the Rails 5 way and sit down and read a book for me to be useful. But I sort of realized that the value that I'm sort of bringing these days is enough, like having seen enough code to know that, this is perhaps, like I think a common mistake that people make is just, making code as dry as possible. They're like, oh, I use this variable twice, or like this thing twice, I'm gonna extract a function now, which is not always the right way to go. I think like Sandy Metz talks a lot about how sometimes when you try to avoid duplication, you end up generating code that's unnecessarily complex and much harder, and more coupled and more cohesive. Who is it? There's someone in London, I can't remember his name now, who talks a lot about connascence or like cohesiveness of code. I can't remember. But it's that kind of thing that, I don't know, I find myself pushing back a lot on cyclomatic complexity and on things that are not, that on the surface look clean and they look nice and they look like good code, but I'm like, in 3 months time, we're gonna have to change this, or like, I think this is gonna be harder to read for someone who's new to this code. So I just try to write code that's as dumb as possible. And I put that in air quotes because I think sometimes, code that is maintainable over the long term is just code that is unsurprising and easy to read, even if it is a little bit duplicated.
Well, yeah, to put it in Willem Larson's term, obvious rather than dumb. And,
yeah.
And the thing is duplication is really a subtle thing. I learned over time to spot duplication that it was duplication in, say, the order of operations rather than in what those operations were. And sometimes that was really helpful to extract out into a template class. But, when you talk about extracting into a method, sometimes I think about, oh, do I really want to do this? Other times I just go ahead and do it because there's every refactoring there's an opposite refactoring. And so I'm working on it and I realize, oh, these things are going to diverge. These two uses and the two needs are going to diverge. Well, I'll just inline it again. And in fact, I often found that as I was working in code, early on in my TD, I was surprised that oh, this is getting a little hard. Let me inline this and then extract something a little different. I didn't get the boundaries quite right of what I wanted to extract. Either I included something that shouldn't have been extracted with it that was not really related, or there was something I left out that what I extracted needed to interact with, or both.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest thing in software, honestly, figuring out what those boundaries are. I think I've watched Gary Bernhardt's talk on boundaries probably 6 or 7 times, and I still don't understand 100% of it. That is just like, because it's not just, I mean, domain boundaries are where you start, right? Like people who talk about domain-driven development, it's like, okay, figure out where your domain objects are, figure out what their relationships are to each other. In bootcamp, we did an exercise called class relationship cards, I think, CRCs, where we took index cards and it was like, okay, if you're modeling a system, say you're modeling, we like often did the Boris bike system in London, which is the same as like bike share in other cities. So like if you were to design a system to model a bike share system in code, what would your main entities be? And so people often reach for like, oh, bicycle, bike rack, maybe empty bike slot sometimes, which is, I don't know. There's all different ways that you can design a system like that. But then the next step is like, okay, now model the relationship between those objects. And that's the really, really hard part, because once you start mapping that out, you're like, ooh, like, is an empty bike and a non-empty bike, like, are they really distinct entities, or are they different states of the same thing? So that gets really trippy real fast, especially if it's your first week of programming ever.
Yeah. So I think CRC is a really interesting way of digging into something, but I've always struggled starting with nouns.
Say more about that.
I start with verbs now, not with the nouns, not with naming the objects, but from the outside in, what process do I want? Okay, so I'm a user and I want to ride a bike. Okay, who do I talk to about accomplishing that? Who would own that behavior, and start from that point of view. And I may not know who it is first, and so I just create something, and as I work with it, then it becomes clearer, and I can say, oh, well, this is really 2 things. Okay, I've got the the reservation system or whatever, but then I only use that for a little bit, and it gives me the use of a bike. And so then I'm just interacting with the bike after that and thinking about who owns this responsibility, which I think is what CRC cards were intended to do.
Yeah, I think so.
But I come at it more from the verb point of view than from the noun point of view.
So I was going to ask, when you said you think more in verbs than nouns, the first question that popped into my mind was, oh, have you been doing a lot of functional programming lately? But then, like, I think that's a little bit unfair to just say that functional programming equals focus on verbs, object-oriented equals focus on nouns. I think it's a lot more complex than that. But the second thought I had after that was, like, if we actually take a step back from, programming paradigms, I think the focus on verbs actually might be a product of, it might be a consequence of software engineers just thinking in a more functional and more product-oriented way, right? Because, like, if you think of how teams write, when we talk about cutting epics or cutting narratives in a vertical way, like what you're trying to deliver to the end user is like an entire end-to-end workflow. It's an ability, or like a capability, I think is what the correct language to use. Yes, I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, I have not been doing functional programming. and this is, I don't know why, this is just the way it made sense to me when I was doing assembly language programming. Is to start with what I'm doing, and I think that in terms of assembly language and C, what you often see is people do that but then they don't take the time to separate them out into the noun clumps. And for whatever reason, that made sense to me because it was easier to read. I knew where to go to find this functionality because I knew who would be doing it. But I approached it, backwards from the way many people approach it.
Yeah, I think people who train in an object-oriented language first these days develop the opposite mental model. I know I was taught figure out the objects, then figure out which objects own which behaviors. So you start with nouns first in that case.
Yeah, and that when I was trying to go from procedural programming to object-oriented programming, that didn't work very well for me. And in fact, I had a hell of a time trying to learn object-oriented programming. The words were all completely different. And then had so I was working on a program to analyze data from an embedded system that I, helped develop. And so we were doing this, we purchased a library that would do graphical user interfaces on a text mode PC. So it would simulate a graphical user interface in text mode. And we purchased a source code license because my point was, this is a small company. What if they go out of business and we run into a problem down the road? We need to be able to fix it. Well, the real benefit of getting that source code license turned out to be to look inside the source code and say, oh, this, calling methods on an object, that's just a struct of function pointers. That's all this class is. and that helped me make be able to translate between what I knew about C to what I knew about object-oriented. So then, now that I understand the mechanism, now the lingo starts making sense because I can translate it back to what I know. It took me a long time before I knew that a method was just a function.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's all kinds of weird, it's funny when things like that click into place after you've been doing the thing for a while. I think one realization that I randomly had later, so I learned Ruby first and then learned JavaScript a little bit later, and then learned, I don't really know Go super well, but I did a little bit of Go at my last job. And I kind of, every time you start a new language, you pick up a new language. I find that it's really the natural thing to do is we map the things we know in our other languages to concepts in the new language. And so you're kind of like, oh, okay, a function is like a method, or a struct in Go is kind of like a class in Ruby, which is not, but that's the easiest mental mapping that most Ruby to Go developers reach for. And I kind of had to learn to let go of that after a while, because I realized that leaning too much on those metaphors, leaning too much on those reference points actually holds you back from learning the idioms of the language that you're trying to learn.
It's a balancing act.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like learning a new spoken language, actually. Because I remember, learning French in high school, and then I spoke Mandarin growing up, and then learned English when I was, a kid, because I grew up in America. But it's incredibly difficult for people to go from English to a non-Romance language. And what I see all the time is when people who are learning Mandarin as adults, they try to map tenses in English to tenses in Mandarin, and that just doesn't map, because the idea of a tense in Mandarin doesn't exist in the same way as it does in English. There are contextual cues that you use in Mandarin, but there is no declension of a verb in Mandarin the way that there is in English.
Yeah. So that mapping is a baby step.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to learn the local idioms to become fluent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of the most interesting things I'll say I've seen in some Go code bases is when people like are very, very clearly like, I used to be a Java developer and we have constructors in Java, or I used to be a Ruby developer and we have classes with methods and instance variables in Ruby, and they try to make those concepts true in Golang. And it's leads to very interesting Go, is all I will say about that.
Yeah, when I was first learning Ruby, I was writing pure Java code in Ruby. And that's the way it is. And this is where having a guide helps to model to model the nuances of what you're trying to learn. Because you don't know what those are, and you won't find them necessarily on your own, because there's what's called negative transference, where what you know inhibits learning something else, because it's similar enough to fool you into thinking that it's the same, and and so you'll hang on to what you know, and it prevents you from learning what's not the same.
Yeah. So what techniques have you maybe used in your coaching over the years to get people from, like they're on a surface level, you can write hello world, right? And maybe you can write a for loop and learn, the basic syntax of any language. But how do you get from that stage to a deeper understanding and like appreciation of the idioms and maybe why they exist? And that's sort of like, I hate the term mastery, but that's the closest approximation of meaning I can think of to, this idea. Comfort, maybe? How do you get there?
Well, I like the word fluency.
That's better. Yeah.
So quite a number of years ago now, Willem Larson was involved in language learning, and his goal was to save languages that were in danger of dying. And so quite often you had to learn a language or teach a language where there was no teacher for that language. And there may be only a few people in the world who could still speak and still understood it. And so he set up this stuff, and he based it on the ACTFL guidelines, which I thought was great. There's sort of two different axes. One is proficiency in the language, which is how much of it you know and can use. But the other is the fluency, which is how readily can you use it. And when you get to the point where you can think in that language, that's a major step in fluency. And it doesn't happen universally across the whole language. But, so in terms of natural languages, going from just the present tense to being able to talk in the past tense, that's a step in proficiency. But then, how easily can you do that? How do you acclimate to that and become fluent in it? And a lot of that is just practice. And it's helpful if you've got at least one person who is fluent. And that's what he would do in these language things. Is he only needed, one elder from a tribe to be able to be there to help a lot of young people in the tribe learn their native language that they had grown up not knowing, because they had been forced to learn English in school. They were no longer, the tribal mechanisms had broken down. So I really like that idea of proficiency versus fluency. And you're right, you want to get fluent in your programming languages so that you can write code without struggling at it, without having to think about the mechanics.
Yeah, right. Like programming languages the service they provide is giving you the language to solve a problem.
To express the problem and express the solution. This is the thing, I take it back to literature again. It's an expression, not just a solution.
Yeah, that's true. I have a couple of friends doing, you've heard of Advent Code. So I have a couple of friends doing Advent of Code right now, and some people are, for those of you who are watching who haven't seen this before, Advent of Code is a yearly challenge that begins on the 1st of December and runs through the end of December. I think it's just adventofcode.org or .com or something, but each day you get a progressively difficult algorithmic challenge to solve. And some people are like, oh, I'm going to use admin of code as an opportunity to learn Haskell for the first time. I'm like, is that a good idea? You don't know Haskell and you also don't know how to solve the problem yet. So what I've had more success with in past years is solve the problem in a language that you know and then resolve it in the language you're trying to learn. I think it's incredibly, I just can't even get started if I pick a language that I don't like, if I don't feel comfortable in it.
Yeah, it's like coding katas, Yeah, you're doing a well-known problem, but you're using a language or some tool, some way of going about it that's new to you. And
yeah, exactly.
And so that only teaches you certain aspects. At some point, yeah, you need to then apply that to new problems that you have no idea how to solve.
Yeah. Yeah, I miss doing katas actually. In London, there were a lot of meetups where you would go and do them together. That was a lot of fun. But I don't know like of any events outside of London really that focus on that aspect of kind of collective learning, and I don't know.
Yeah, right now there's a number of people who are doing online mobbing or ensemble programming sessions doing katas. And I've done a few of those, and that can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I should try to look for some of those and tune in. I find that the more challenging problems I have to solve at work these days, and most of the problems I work on the hardest problems I work on are not programming problems anymore. They're human problems and communication problems. I find that I just have so little energy left for programming outside of work.
I understand that. And that's why I do so little programming now, is because most of my work as a consultant and coach is working on those human problems, because that's usually what's holding people back at the technical level. Is the organizational level is getting in their way.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I've never worked in consulting before in that kind of capacity, but I would like to someday. Do you have any good war stories about untangling an especially tangled organization that you're allowed to say?
War stories, I don't know. I lean heavily on the work of Virginia Satir now, and who was a family therapist. And you have to look at the organization as a whole, because nobody in the organization, like nobody in the family, can change independently, because it changes the system. It's, the behaviors in the relationships, not in the people. And I learned that from Jerry Weinberg. That's where I met Esther Derby, and she and Don Gray, who I actually knew on CompuServe before then. They do, they've got a fabulous course called Coaching Beyond the Team, which goes into a lot of these. It's a good starting point. But it's beyond the one-on-one coaching, which a lot of people are talking about these days, which I see is based on the work of Carl Rogers, which I studied in college in psychology class, which was one-on-one, non-directive sort of coaching. And but you need to see how the pieces interact with each other. The problems people face in organizations and teams is beyond that individual person.
Yeah. Oh man, I wish we didn't have 2 minutes left, because I feel like this is a really juicy subject to dive into. But just like the idea of complex organisms and complex systems.
We'll have another conversation sometime.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, I'd love to talk further about that. It's a big thing to me.
Oh, definitely. I remember like one of the first concepts around this that I encountered when I also was like only a few years into software development. I watched Liz Keogh give a talk about Craven at a conference. Craven is a Welsh word. I forgot what it actually means, but it is spelled Cynefin for folks who are listening. And it's how would you describe it? It's basically a framework for analyzing problems, types of problems that you might encounter, and it's not specific to software. but it's just one of those mind-boggling frameworks that once you see it, you're like, whoa, I wish I had this years and years ago.
Well, and Liz is great at explaining it. She really is.
Yeah,
She's so smart.
she is. We should get her onto one of these chain conversations in the future.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it was great chatting with you, George. I learned a ton in the last 30 minutes.
It was great chatting with you, Denise. And let's talk some more. I'm glad to meet you. And I feel like we have stuff in common to talk about.
Yeah, likewise. Well, have a great rest of your day.